Good morning. We're going to be talking about evolution in this video lecture. I apologize for my froggy voice. I've got a little bit of a cold going on, so my voice seems a little deeper than normal, which may be better for some of you. I don't know. Anyway, when we start off talking about evolution, one of the first things I like to do in Bio 1 is just try to reassure everybody a little bit. In the South, in the Bible Belt in particular, we can get a little twitchy when we start talking about evolution because many of us have been taught that evolution is not something that we should believe in. And the first thing I want to reiterate is that evolution is not a belief system. Evolution is a scientific theory, and a scientific theory is the closest we get in science to truth because theories have been extensively tested. They've been modified as necessary when experiments and data require it. So a theory in science is not just a speculation. When someone says to you, oh, evolution is just a theory, they're using the word theory the way that we use it in our everyday life, not the way that it's used in science. There's nothing in science about a theory that justifies putting the word just in front of it as if it's just a guess. Scientific theories are much more substantiated than that. They have been very thoroughly and rigorously tested. The other thing that I want to say briefly about evolution is that it's not an either or between evolution and religion. There are plenty of religious people who accept the scientific basis of evolution, and there are plenty of scientific people who also have religious faith. So if you have been brought up in a situation that this has been presented to you as an either or, I would encourage you to do some additional reading and learning on your own. If you are curious about where to go for information, I am happy to point you in the direction of some things that might be beneficial. But the first thing we're going to talk about related to the chapters and the actual content of evolution is that evolution is a unifying theme of biology. So your textbook talks about how evolution can explain both the unity and diversity of life on Earth. And that at first seems to be a contradiction. How can one theory explain both how life is united and the diversity of life on Earth? And it all comes down to time, really, that biological time is so vast, and that over long periods of time, living things on Earth have diversified from a common ancestor. The unity part comes in that DNA really is what unifies living things. As we have in the scientific community as our tools for investigating and analyzing the DNA of organisms across living things has improved, we have found that there are very many genes, which are parts of DNA, that living things have in common. And the most important genes for regulating life are similar, whether we're talking about single-celled bacteria or whether we're talking about multicellular human beings. So that unity is really astounding. Living things are divided into three distinct domains. Domains are the broadest level of classification for living things. When I was in high school, it was the kingdom level. But since then, because of the molecular biology tools that allow us to analyze DNA and proteins, we've realized that the kingdom level doesn't tell the whole picture, because in the kingdom level, all unicellular organisms were grouped together in one kingdom. But through molecular biology tools such as genomics, which is analyzing DNA sequences from various organisms, and proteomics, which is analyzing proteins from various organisms, we realized that all of the unicellular organisms didn't need to be in the same group, that they needed to be in two different groups. And so now we have the domain bacteria, which is one group of single-celled organisms, and we have the domain archaea. And while there is, of course, some overlap between the two, that they are more dissimilar to each other than similar, and so therefore they deserve to be in separate groups. All of the eukaryotes then are in the domain eukarya, which includes all of the plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So as you know, when we start talking about evolution, Charles Darwin always comes to mind. Well, Darwin lived in the early 1800s, and his father was a physician and wanted Darwin to be a physician as well. Darwin went to medical school, but he was not cut out for it. Surgery in the time before modern anesthesia was a very gruesome business, and Darwin just couldn't stomach it. Instead, he was in love with nature. He was fascinated with collecting beetles and making really detailed observations about the natural world. And so instead, he went to Cambridge and studied to become a clergyman, right? Studied to be part of the church. And this was not an unusual route, because at that time, most of the natural scientists were also members of the clergy. So this seemed to be a natural fit for Darwin. But what was really unique about Darwin was his ability to think outside the box, to think about these big ideas and not just accept the standard explanation for things, that the earth was less than 10,000 years old, that living things still existed exactly the way God had created them less than 10,000 years ago. He knew about all of those prevailing ideas, of course, but when he compared those ideas to what he saw in the world around him, it didn't fit. And so he had all of these questions that he wanted to answer. At Darwin's time, there were a lot, like I said, a lot of prevailing ideas. And one of them was this idea of the scala natura. This idea was as old as Aristotle. And so it was this notion that all life on Earth could be put in order, sequentially getting more complicated. And notice that down here on the bottom, there are even some lower levels down here. If the scala natura was still a thing, today we would have the prokaryotes and the bacteria and stuff way down here. And then as we progressively get more complicated, and notice, of course, that at the time, humans were at the very top. Okay, so it was understood to be this linear progression of complexity and also, of course, of importance. Darwin was influenced by a variety of thinkers. One of them was Carolus Linnaeus. Linnaeus is responsible for creating the biological naming system called binomial nomenclature. You've probably heard of this before. So when we think about scientific names, having that genus name and that species name, binomial nomenclature is responsible for that. So Linnaeus was inspired to create an organization system that would make sense of all of the wonders of God's creation. So there was this funny little quote that people would say about Linnaeus, that God created, but Linnaeus organized. And so his organization system would start with these big groups that were very diverse. And as you went down, you got more and more and more specific. So for example, in this figure, the genus level is Canis, right? And so we've got the dogs and the wolves. And then more specifically would be the wolf, Canis lupus. And so as you went down this hierarchy, you got more and more specific. Well, Darwin saw this classification system of Linnaeus, and he understood over time that these groupings could be based not just on observed similarities, but also evolutionary similarities. Not just the things that one could see necessarily, but also those changes that had happened over time. So Linnaeus was one of Darwin's influencers. Another significant influencer was Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell wrote a book called Principles of Geology. And one of the things that you have to understand about the time that Darwin was living is that the prevailing understanding is that the world didn't change, that the world existed exactly as God created it. Well, Lyell and some others who studied geology could look at the earth, they could look at the layers in the rocks, and they could look and see that when these violent changes like earthquakes and volcanoes happened, excuse me, that changed the landscape, that changed the way the rock forms existed. And so Lyell was advocating that the surface of the earth was changing over time, over long periods of time, that rivers eroded mountains and created canyons and valleys, and that earthquakes raised up mountains and lowered them, and that when you looked at the layers in the rocks, that they weren't always perfectly horizontal, that you could see these horizontal layers side by side with vertical layers in sedimentary rock. And how could that have happened naturally without some violent change that caused what had been these naturally horizontal layers that caused some violent shift and move them around? Something was at work, and it wasn't just in the past. Those same forces were still at work. So after Darwin graduated from Cambridge, he was recommended to be a ship's companion to the captain of the Beagle. And the Beagle was a ship whose job it was to explore and map the coast of South America. Darwin went along on that voyage, and while he was employed as the ship's naturalist and a companion to the captain, they both had similar education. They were from similar social class, so they would make good companions. And notice that this voyage took 5 years. So the captain needed somebody to talk to, and that somebody was Darwin. But on this voyage, Darwin spent most of his time on the shore of the locations that the Beagle was exploring and mapping. And he collected thousands of specimens, plants, animals, fungi, anything that he could collect, he did. He made extensive notes. He would crate up his specimens and send them back to England, because there was no way that the little Beagle could contain all of the specimens that Darwin collected. And as he was collecting these things and making notes, he was recognizing that Many of the organisms that he saw on the coast of South America were very different than some of the organisms that he saw in Australia or in Africa. There were similarities, of course, but there were differences. And Darwin was recognizing that organisms were adapted to their particular locations. And he was recognizing that those adaptations meant that populations of organisms had changed over time to be better suited to their environment. How could that happen if the earth was still exactly the same as it was when God created it less than 10,000 years ago? All of these things are causing cognitive dissonance for Darwin, and they just don't fit together anymore. And instead of trying to explain those differences away, Darwin explored them. He tried to make sense of them. So you've probably all heard the story of Darwin going to the Galapagos and seeing all of these little birds hopping around and realizing that the birds on the islands looked very different than the birds on the South American mainland. So let's go back here and make sure that we recognize that right here, those are the Galapagos, okay? So they're off the western coast of South America. They're a relatively young volcanic archipelago. So they were also very rocky, and from a distance didn't look like they could inhabit much of anything. But when the Beagle went to this archipelago and were exploring all of these islands, Darwin recognized that they were teeming with life, and that many of the organisms that were there looked very similar to what he had seen on the South American continent, but yet they were different. Again, they appeared to be adapted to their particular location. Well, as biologists did in the 1800s and sometimes still do today, Darwin killed just about everything he could find, and at least an example of every different kind of organism that he saw, and collected specimens. And the birds that he collected, he didn't realize in the beginning that they were finches. He thought they were various species of mockingbirds and different types of birds. He did not realize that they were all finches until he had sent his specimens back to London and was working with a renowned ornithologist who said, you know what, these birds that all have very different sizes, they all have very different beak shapes, they were in fact all finches. They were just different species of finches. And so over time, Darwin began to develop this theory of how, okay, this ancestral finch population that had probably been blown to the Galapagos in a storm because it was farther than the birds could naturally fly, had landed in these islands. They were then isolated from other members of their population, which meant they could no longer mate with the finches on the South American mainland. And over long periods of time, these species began to diversify. Okay. And one of the really important things about evolution that a lot of times we don't understand is that a population of ancestral organisms does not gradually morph into the species that we have today, leaving necessarily none of the original population behind. And that's one of the things that you'll hear sometimes people who don't understand evolution say that, well, if humans evolved from apes, why are there still apes? Well, that's not how evolution works. It's not a gradual morphing of all of one entire species into something else. It's a branching. Okay, so there are events that will happen over long periods of time that will cause some members of a population to accumulate these differences until eventually they are different enough from the original group that they are considered to be their own species. And when multiple of those events happen over time, we get this diversity. But because all of these finches can trace their origin back to an ancestral finch, there's still lots of things that they have in common. Well, when you hear this story about Darwin and the finches, it's often presented as if Darwin was sitting on the beach on the Galapagos Island watching all these little birds, hop around, and he suddenly had this full-blown theory of evolution by natural selection that just appeared in his mind, right? Well, that's not at all how it happened. It happened over long periods of time. It happened in collaboration with other scientists. Darwin didn't know what he was looking at in the beginning. He didn't recognize the importance of those birds. And in fact, he had mistakenly collected samples from two different islands, not labeled them, and put them in the same bag. So he didn't recognize all of their importance in the beginning. It was only in retrospect that he really began to recognize the importance of those finches. So as Darwin is thinking about how is it that the fossils that he found on the coast of South America were larger than any of the living species that he saw on the coast at the time that he was there, yet they still maintained some physical similarities. How is it that naturally these organisms, these populations of organisms are changing in their physical characteristics, changing how they're adapted to the modern environment? And he started making connections between the natural processes, what he began to think of as natural selection, and what he knew took place in agriculture, in artificial selection. Darwin knew that farmers and livestock breeders could artificially select for the traits that they wanted through selective breeding programs. He knew that cows could be artificially selected for the cows that gave the best milk. And so we have these populations of cows now that are dairy cows specifically, that are different from the cows that are raised for beef to feed people. He knew that pigeons were a big thing when Darwin was alive, and they were called fanciers, and they bred pigeons. And he knew, if you want to Google it, Google Darwin's pigeons, and you'll see all of these different bizarre looking pigeons that had been artificially selected for different traits, and they looked extremely different from one another, yet they were all pigeons. And so Darwin is reasoning that if people can selectively breed organisms for their desired traits and diversify a population of pigeons into this really diverse different groups, if people could intentionally do that over a relatively short period of time, then couldn't that happen naturally just over longer periods of time? Another example of artificial selection is all of the different vegetables that we have now that originally came from wild mustard. I just find this to be extremely fascinating. That, you have natural variation within a population. And so there were wild mustard plants that naturally had some larger, meatier, more hardy leaves. Those plants were artificially bred together to select for plants that were mostly these big hardy leaves, and that eventually has become what we know as kale. Other wild mustard plants had oddly large buds on the side. Those were selected and eventually have come to what we now know as Brussels sprouts. The same thing happened for cabbage, for broccoli and kohlrabi. All these different vegetables that we now think of as completely different plants. We don't think of broccoli and kale being the same plant, right? They're not anymore. They have been selectively bred for, and now we can buy specific broccoli seed, we can buy kale seed, but they all originally came from the wild mustard plant. I just find that to be fascinating. So again, Darwin is reasoning that if all of this could happen intentionally with people, then nature could do the same thing over large periods of time. And so Darwin called his idea descent with modification. Again, it's this idea that there are ancestral populations that over large periods of time, they begin to accumulate differences in their heritable traits. And this is really important. Only traits that are heritable, in other words, that can be passed on from one generation to the next, are related to evolution of populations. If I accumulate or acquire some sort of a mutation or some sort of a change in my tooth structure, for example, as an adult, that is not a heritable trait. I'm not going to pass that on to my kids. For one thing, I've already had kids, right? But for another thing, the cells that make up my mouth are not the cells that are passed on to future generations. So it's only those heritable traits that are important when we're thinking about descent with modification, that over many generations, populations of organisms acquire changes, okay? Those changes that are passed on from one generation to the next. If we look at this figure, well, let me point out one more thing. The figure on the left is a page out of Darwin's notebook as he was sketching out this descent with modification model, this tree of life. And notice these two words right here, I think, okay? Darwin is recognizing that this idea of descent with modification, that living things are different than they were thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, that this is going to cause a firestorm in the religious community. And Darwin is really sensitive to that. And it takes him a very long time before he is ready to share his work with the world, his ideas, because he knows that there are going to be people who will not accept what he's saying because it goes against the main teaching of the church. Now, let's look over here at this figure a little bit more. This is a diagram that includes the 3 living species of elephants. Okay? Well, if we trace the common ancestor of elephants back, their last common ancestor lived about 4 million years ago. But notice that between elephants and manatees and hyraxes, there are multiple organisms that are all extinct. Okay? The mammoths, the mastodons, all of these are gone. Manatees and elephants are related, distantly related to each other, but they look very, very different. And so people wonder, how is it that you could possibly think that these marine organisms are possibly related to these massive land creatures that live in Africa and Asia when they look so different from one another? And Darwin referred to these ideas, this problem, as a morphological gap. Morphology meaning how something looks. And so the argument is, what we know from the fossil record and now from genomics and proteomics, is that we've got massive amounts of evidence that show that all of these organisms are related to each other. This morphological gap is the result of many different species that are no longer living. They've gone extinct. And so it's harder for us to imagine these relationships between manatees and elephants because we no longer see all of these organisms that have gone extinct. So Darwin put all of his ideas together and to what he referred to as natural selection. That natural selection is what causes descent with modification. And natural selection is based on differential reproductive success. In other words, within a population of organisms, there's going to be variation. Some of those organisms are going to be naturally better adapted to their environment. They're going to be more likely to reproduce and pass their traits on to their offspring. Whatever traits those parents have that make them better suited to their environment, as long as those traits are heritable, in other words, they're part of the DNA, part of the germline, those traits can be passed on to their offspring. So if we look at this figure, we have a population of beetles, and notice that within this population, there are beetles that vary in how dark their shells are. Well, birds like to eat beetles. And so if this population, this hypothetical population of beetles, is living in an area that has a dark background, maybe they live on trees with dark bark or something, birds are going to have an easier time eating and seeing and eating the beetles with lighter colored shells. They're going to stand out more. And so if the beetles with the lighter colored shells are eaten before they have the opportunity to reproduce, then over time, this population of beetles is going to gradually shift to where almost all of the beetles are going to have that dark coloration because birds ate the light ones. They didn't have a chance to pass those light colored traits on. So this is more of a hypothetical example, but something very similar to this happened in England at the time of the Industrial Revolution with a population of organisms known as the peppered moth. And the peppered moths naturally had variation in the color of their wings. Some were lighter, some were darker. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, these moths naturally were found in trees that had relatively light colored bark. And so the moths that were darker colored were more easily spotted by the predators. And so you had more of the light colored moths than the dark ones. After the Industrial Revolution was started and was going on, there was massive amounts of coal dust that was and smoke that was being pumped into the environment, and it came to land on the trees, and it darkened their trunks. Well, then the lighter colored moths stood out, and so over time, that population of moths changed to where most of them had that darker color. Were they still the same species of moth? Yes. But that heritable trait of wing color had changed based on which moths lived long enough to reproduce. And after the Industrial Revolution, it was the dark colored ones that lived long enough to reproduce because they were more protected from predators. Well, Darwin didn't know anything about DNA, okay? But we know more than Darwin did now about DNA. And we know that our chromosomes are these long linear stretches of DNA. And within each chromosome are shorter stretches of DNA that we refer to as genes. Okay? Genes are responsible for directing the production of RNA, which can go on, depending on the type of RNA that's made. There are 3 different types of RNAs. Well, there's more than 3 actually, but there's 3 main types. messenger RNA, ribosomal RNA, and transfer RNA, and we'll talk a lot more about these types much later in the class. And then mRNA is used to make proteins, and you're going to hear me say this over and over and over this semester, that proteins are the workers of the cell. Okay? So, for example, this figure is showing us a chromosome, and there's a region on this chromosome that contains a gene. That gene is responsible for creating a protein that is found, that determines hair texture. So one version of the protein leads people to have curly hair. Another version of that protein leads people to have straight hair. And if you look at the coding region of the gene, it's a difference in the DNA sequence. One little difference, right? A TAC to a TAG that changes the protein that results in individuals' hair having a different texture. Well, different versions of genes that lead to different versions of gene products are called alleles. And that's going to be a really important word, okay? Alleles are different versions of genes. And most of you have probably learned some things about Mendel, right? And about dominant and recessive traits with pea plants and all of that. Well, for some traits, there really are only two genes or two alleles, a dominant and a recessive. But for most traits, there are multiple alleles for a particular trait. And so it's that allele frequency within a population that's responsible for all of the variation that we see in populations of organisms. So evolution depends on genetic variability within populations. Okay, well, what causes genetic variability? There are a variety of mechanisms. Genetic variability can arise through random mutation. So some change, some event that causes a change to the DNA sequence of a gene. Now, we tend to hear the word mutation and we think that mutations are always bad. Okay, well, they're not. Mutations can be neutral. They can have no effect on an individual. Mutations can be beneficial, and mutations can be detrimental. Well, if mutations happen that turn out to be beneficial, and those beneficial mutations confer a reproductive advantage to the organisms that contain that new allele, then those organisms are more likely to be able to reproduce and pass that allele on. Okay, so mutation is one mechanism for genetic variability. Other ways that genes can be changed have to do with cellular processes that occur during cell division during meiosis. Meiosis can increase genetic variability, and we'll talk about that more later. Organisms that reproduce sexually increase genetic variability. Okay. The main thing that I just want you to understand right now is that in order for natural selection to happen, in order for evolution to happen, there has to be genetic variability. If every organism within a particular population is genetically identical, there's nothing to be selected for. natural selection can't happen without genetic variability. Sorry about that. Okay, so again, mechanisms of evolution depends on genetic variability. We see that genetic variability in the case of this beetle example show up in the color of their shells. All right, so when we talk about evolution, as we're going to see later, does not only involve the creation over long periods of time of new species of organisms. Evolution just means that the allele frequencies within a population are changing. Okay, so in this example, we have a small population of flowers, and within this population of flowers, there are 3 different colors, red, pink, and white. Well, let's say we have our original population of 10 plants. Well, from generation 1 to generation 2, only these plants that are highlighted leave offspring. Okay? Within this population, there are 2 different alleles that determine flower color. Okay? There's a red allele and a white allele. And the plants that have one of each wind up being pink. Okay? Well, if we look at how many of the plants in our original population had the red allele, at least one copy of the red allele, 70% of them did. Only 30% had at least one copy of the white allele. So there was a 70 to 30 ratio of red to white alleles. In generation 2, that allele frequency changed to where there was an equal number of red alleles and white alleles represented within the population. And if you look at the colors of the plants, you can tell that in generation 2, that mixture of colors was different than in generation 1. Well, between generation 2 and 3, let's pretend that, a deer comes along and eats all but 2 of these plants. And these 2 plants are red. They have 2 of the red alleles. Those 2 plants are the only ones that have offspring. And so now, in generation 3, every single plant has red flowers because the allele for white randomly was eliminated from that population just through random chance. Okay? The allele frequency changed. It changed the way that population looked. And if this population remains isolated, then from here on out, future generations of these plants are only going to have red flowers because the white allele has been completely eliminated. Okay, so this population has evolved. Is it still the same species of flower, a plant? Yes, they just look different because the allele frequency has changed. That white allele is gone. You can't have pink or white flowers without it in this particular example. All right, so there are a variety of mechanisms of evolution that can change allele frequencies within a population. If we go back to this flower example, one of the main ways that allele frequencies can change within a population is referred to as genetic drift. And genetic drift is just based purely on random chance. Okay, so in our flower example, all of the flowers got eaten or stepped on something except these 2 red ones, and therefore our population changed. For genetic drift, there are 2 additional specific cases. One of them is referred to as a bottleneck event. Okay, and bottlenecks are usually about some sort of natural disaster. So, for example, we have this original population, and you can see that in this original population, it looks like there's a decent amount of both blue and white marbles, very few yellow ones. Okay, there's some natural disaster, some event that creates a bottleneck, okay? And when you have a bottleneck, you can't dump the whole population of marbles out at one time. Only a few can go through at a time. So whether that's a fire, whether that's a flood, whether it's some kind of an earthquake or something that kills off most of the population, and only a very few survive that bottleneck. Well, that surviving population is going to look different. If you look at this surviving population, notice we don't have any yellow marbles anymore. And our ratio of blue to white has changed significantly. Okay? This surviving population looks different than our original population because the allele frequency has changed. And over time, as this population recovers, the recovered population is going to continue to look different than that original one. Okay? Random chance as to which organisms survived that bottleneck. Another mechanism for within the idea of genetic drift is known as the founder effect. So if you have an ancestral population of organisms living in a certain location, and something happens and only a few of those organisms, let's say in the case of the Galapagos Islands, get caught up in a storm and they get blown to a new location where none of those organisms exist. These colonizers are going to now constitute a new population, especially if the distance is such that the members of these two populations, if they can't easily go back and forth, then we now have two isolated populations. This colonizer population, the allele frequency is likely going to be different than the ancestral population. And so this new population of organisms that is founding this new population on a new location, that allele frequency is going to be different. And as these organisms survive and leave offspring, the allele frequency of the offspring is going to be different than the ancestral population. Okay, and so that's the idea of the founder effect. This happened on the Galapagos Island. It also happened with human beings when small groups of human beings would go and colonize new locations that maybe humans hadn't lived before. Any kind of heritable characteristics that were unusual in those founders are likely going to be found at higher frequencies in their offspring. All right, so those were examples of genetic drift. Another mechanism that can alter allele frequencies within a population is gene flow. Okay, so a real life example of gene flow happens within Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. And so there's a population of water snakes that live on the land, right, in Ohio and Ontario and Michigan. And some of those snakes can swim from the mainland to the islands in the Great Lakes. Okay. Well, the landscape on the islands is different than the landscape on the land. On the mainland, most of or more of the snakes that live on the mainland have a very distinct banding pattern. And if you look at this snake right here, you see that the colors, you have different bands of colors throughout the body of that snake. The snakes that live on the islands, though, are primarily unbanded, and it's because that they blend in better when they don't have those variations in color. So what are predators of snakes? Well, we tend to think of snakes as predators, but snakes can also be prey to large birds, especially eagles and hawks and vultures and ravens and all of those birds of prey. The snakes that are unbanded survive better on the islands. The snakes that are banded survive better on the mainland. Well, then why haven't these two populations of snakes completely diverged from one another such that all of the snakes on the island have no bands? Well, it's because occasionally, and scientists have studied these populations of snakes over time, and they've tagged them and tracked them, and what they find is that every summer, a few snakes manage to swim from the mainland to the island, and they are carrying their alleles with them. So if you've got banded snakes that swim from the mainlands to the island, their genes are flowing into those island populations, and they're carrying that allele for banded coloration with them. And so if they mate with the island unbanded snakes, then some of those offspring are going to have bands. And because those migration events happen on a regular enough basis, that those two populations of snakes, the mainland snakes and the island snakes, have not completely diverged from one another because of gene flow, okay? Because those alleles are occasionally intermingling within the different populations. All right, so what are mechanisms that promote evolution, that change allele frequencies within a population? We've got genetic drift, which are random events. We've got gene flow. We've got natural selection. Okay, those are the three main mechanisms for evolution. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about some persistent misconceptions that makes it difficult sometimes for us to wrap our heads around evolution. One of these ideas is geological time. Okay, we just, as human beings, don't understand the scale of geological time. So if we imagine this evolutionary clock, okay, where 1 hour is 570 million years, all right, back to when the first, multicellular organisms began to emerge on planet Earth. All right, at about 6 minutes and 52 seconds, the first fish appeared. But prior to this, remember, we've got, single-celled organisms evolving into the first eukaryotes, evolving into the first, multicellular organisms that didn't have vertebrates in these large supporting structures. So there's a lot that was going on in this time. It's just not shown on this figure. Okay. Well, human beings wouldn't have shown up until 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Okay. We tend to think of everything important happening on planet Earth has happened in our lifetime or in the collective lifetime of human beings. But there's a whole lot of time that came before human beings ever showed up. And that's where the majority of the diversification, the evolutionary diversification was happening. We just have a hard time thinking on those time scales. So I just want you to recognize that when we're talking about planet Earth and we're talking about evolutionary time, we're talking about millions and millions and millions and millions of years. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Another persistent misconception related to evolution is that evolution is the same thing as speciation, that evolution means new species are being created. Well, no, it doesn't, right? Speciation can happen. Of course it does. That's why we have all of those branch points on our cladograms and things. But speciation events are very, very rare. Remember, evolution just means an allele frequency within a population is changing. Okay, so allele frequency change within a population. And it's really important to understand that a population of organisms is the smallest unit of evolution. Individual organisms do not evolve. I cannot evolve into a better adapted individual to my environment. Okay, I might have in my egg cells, when I was developing as an embryo in my mother and my egg cells were being formed, there could have been some mutation in my egg cells that I might pass on to my children, and they might have different heritable traits than me. But individuals do not evolve. It's a population. It's individuals within a population that wind up accumulating these heritable traits that cause the allele frequency within the entire population to change. It's not based on individual organisms. Another really important thing to understand is that evolution is not based on need. Okay? Populations of organisms don't evolve because they need to be better adapted to their environment. A giraffe didn't evolve a long neck because it needed to be able to reach the leaves high up in the acacia trees in the savannas. That's not how it happened. It's not based on need. They're random events that can lead to members of a population having a reproductive advantage, and that reproductive advantage being passed on to their children, so that over time that population changes, the allele frequency changes, but it's only based on random events. It's not directional. It's not based on need. Another persistent misconception, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that ancestral species just slowly morph over time into modern species. And this is a persistent figure that stirs up a lot of feelings in people, and the idea that, human beings evolved from apes. Well, they didn't evolve from apes, okay? Humans and apes do share a common ancestor, okay? But that diversification happened a long time ago, all right? It's not something that was recent. But there are common ancestors that are shared, but it doesn't mean that when these speciation events happen, that all of one population is suddenly just gone. There are plenty of extinction events. There have been plenty of different species of the genus Homo, right? We're Homo sapiens. There have been plenty of different species that have that genus name that are now extinct, okay? But it wasn't this gradual morphing from one species into another, and the original ones just all suddenly change into something new. So that's just another one of those persistent misconceptions about evolution. We're going to be talking about some of these ideas in class on Wednesday and on Friday, so please come with questions, and we'll talk about some of these more difficult concepts a little bit more in class.